Currently, a staggering 121 nations are in the process of divesting from U.S. Treasury bonds, a move that has plunged the U.S., which has long relied on borrowing, into a precarious situation. The urgency of the U.S. Secretary of Commerce's visit to China is a clear indication of seeking China's assistance in this dire circumstance. The motive behind her visit is transparent: the U.S. is seeking a lifeline from China. In recent days, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo has landed in Beijing, embarking on her visit to China. Her visit's objectives were evident even prior, focusing primarily on addressing the economic and trade disputes between the U.S. and China while aiming to foster pragmatic collaboration between the two economic giants. In reality, Raimondo's trip to China is predominantly aimed at securing China's support. The continuous economic frictions between the U.S. and China have been increasingly apparent, revealing the struggles faced by the U.S. economy. The ballooning U.S. fiscal deficit and escalating debt levels underscore the challenges. Although U.S. Treasury bonds have historically been a pivotal global investment, they are progressively being regarded as high-risk assets. As a result, a proposition has emerged to have China assume the responsibility of purchasing these bonds, alleviating the burden on the U.S. Reflecting on the landscape of 2022, the U.S. maintained its status as the world's foremost economic powerhouse, with a monumental GDP of $25.46 trillion, firmly securing its preeminent position. In contrast, China closely followed with a GDP of 121 trillion yen, securing a steadfast second place. However, significant shifts have surreptitiously emerged. The U.S.'s debt predicament has gradually emerged, abruptly revealing a jolting default crisis. Concurrently, the U.S. has escalated its sustained pressure on mainland Chinese enterprises, eliciting profound concern. The latter half of 2022 marked a pivotal turning point. China embarked on a calculated path of reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, a robust countermeasure against the Biden administration's strategy to curb China's ascendancy. This maneuver has persisted for a span of 7 months. Commencing with holdings of approximately $1.32 trillion in U.S. bonds, China's holdings have dwindled to a mere $848.8 billion. A striking consequence of this strategy is the sale of nearly half its U.S. bond holdings, totaling an astounding $471.2 billion. Yet, even more striking is China's intensified resolve to divest from U.S. bonds, coinciding with the bankruptcy of Silicon Valley Bank and the futility of the Federal Reserve's interest rate policies. It appears China has pinpointed a vulnerability and swiftly exploited it, exacerbating the U.S.'s impending default crisis. However, this isn't an isolated countermeasure enacted solely by China. Among the top 10 global holders of U.S. Treasury bonds, 8 countries are pursuing divestment. These countries encompass U.S. allies such as Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and Canada. Taking Japan as an example, a historical U.S. ally, which once surpassed China in U.S. bond holdings, is now concurrently divesting, with the scale even surpassing China's. The actions undertaken by these nations reflect not just economic calculus but also resonate with national sentiment. Particularly for Japan, the U.S.'s historical exertion of pressure on its semiconductor industry during the 20th century, nearly precipitating its collapse, still haunts the Japanese. This dynamic is emblematic of the inevitable consequences of the U.S.'s cutthroat competitive strategies, which have bred global discontent and anger. Faced with the prevailing predicament, the U.S. has resorted to a plea for China's assistance. However, this practice of seeking assistance while simultaneously aggravating relationships is bound to evoke China's resolute defense of its own interests. Following a series of containment policies and a lack of earnestness, the U.S.'s attempt to solicit China's aid is naivete at its peak. The consensus among media is that this is an inevitable consequence of antagonizing China. Recently, China proposed the one must, three stops principle as a fundamental prerequisite for future communication. One must entails the US respecting China's boundaries, refraining from vilification, and ceasing interference in sensitive matters such as the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Meanwhile, three stops demands the US halt its infringement on China's sovereignty, threats to its security, and the unjust constraints and suppression imposed on Chinese enterprises, all of which are the outcomes of the US's years of unwarranted sanctions on China. True dialogue can only emerge based on these premises. However, the US response to these demands remains equivocal. Regardless of the outcome, China is unwavering in safeguarding its interests, refusing to be deceived by hollow gestures of cooperation that lack substantial assistance. Amidst turbulent times, a focus on national interests and meticulous planning is paramount. In 2022, Japan held its position as the globe's third-largest economy with a GDP of $5.1 trillion. Yet, within the context of the US's impending default crisis, this figure seems inconsequential. While the US celebrated its 2022 GDP of $25.46 trillion, the towering $31 trillion in US bond debt and a debt-to-GDP ratio of approximately 130% underscore the US's severe debt predicament. Significantly, China remains the solitary potential savior. However, given China's previous assistance during the 2008 US financial crisis, a repeat intervention seems improbable. In recent years, the US's actions have perpetuated a destructive cycle, revealing its true wolf in sheep's clothing nature. The selfishness and ruthless competitive strategies inherent in US capitalism render it undeserving of any aid. International media consistently emphasize that these actions have bred a reservoir of global resentment, with the consequences now surfacing. Confronting this protracted strategic maneuvering, China's one must, three stops condition stands as a sensible proposition. The US must respect China's boundaries, desist from sovereignty violations, cease threats to security, and abandon the inequitable restrictions and suppression of Chinese businesses. These demands encapsulate China's rightful quest to uphold its national interests. Today, China substantiates this through practical action, demonstrating that enduring and stable international cooperation can only be built upon mutual respect and equality. Indeed, it's not limited to Raimondo. Previously, even U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's visit to China sought Chinese assistance, with the hope of increased Chinese holdings of U.S. bonds. But why does the U.S. insist on China buying its bonds? Primarily because China, as the world's second-largest economy, has the capacity to amass substantial U.S. bonds. China's potential move could potentially encourage other nations to follow suit. Nonetheless, even if the US pleads for China's bond purchases, it's unlikely to sway China, which comprehends Raimondo's underlying motives. While China welcomed Raimondo's visit, it does not imply acquiescence to the US's economic demands. As was the case during Yellen's visit, China is hospitable, yet the prospect of purchasing US bonds remains doubtful. The US has frequently advocated for a decoupling from China, but does this resonate with reality? Using US bonds as an illustration, China's strategic actions have established an unassailable position, making decoupling virtually unfeasible. If the US anticipates China resolving its own predicament, China's cooperation is equally improbable. Moreover, China will persist in systematically shedding US bonds, awaiting the opportune moment. This could potentially lead to a complete divestment. For the US, which has perpetually relied on debt to sustain its economy, this could prove a devastating blow. This isn't mere rhetoric. No nation trifles with its own interests. The US ought to be prepared to bear the consequences, given that this scenario is a direct outcome of the US government's successive interest rate hikes.